Kael Varn, once a soldier, now a man haunted by the past lives in isolation, hiding from the world's collapse. But when strangers arrive seeking refuge, he opens the door. However, something feels wrong. These people carry secrets, and Kael realizes that they're not just fleeing, they may be the key to something far greater. Luma, a child among them, holds an enzyme in her blood that Kael once failed to find a miracle but a potential weapon. As the past collides with the present, Kael must protect them, even if it means confronting a truth he's not ready to face. We are never truly alone until silence stops being peaceful. That night the storm didn't whisper, it screamed. Shards of snow scraped sideways across the dome, like claws on glass hurling themselves at Kael's shelter, with the fury of a world long forgotten. The wind, brutal and sharp, pierced the air vents with an animalistic cry, icing the solar panels and rattling every steel joint of the structure. Inside, Kael Varn sat in his usual place, across from the dimmed greenhouse bay cup of recycled brew in his calloused hands, his breath a ghost before him. The only light was a flickering console glow painting harsh lines on the tired creases of his face. His pulse was steady. His mind was not. The knock didn't startle him. It froze him. 3 sharp raps, desperate but distinct. Not the wind, not the ice shifting. Something was out there, and they had knocked. Kael didn't move at first. He just stared at the sealed airlock door like a man watching a hallucination, knowing too well that no one came here. Not to Daranis Theta, not this far from trade routes, not this close to winter's full grip. The second knock came softer but closer to breaking, followed by a thud. A body. Kael dropped the mug. It shattered, so did the trance. He moved fast, habit not heroism, snatching his thick coat and sidearm. The internal lock hissed reluctantly, the outer airlock roaring as the pressure equalized. He braced against the wind and opened the door, and there she was. A figure slumped against the metal frame, half buried in snow. Her skin was an unnatural shade of blue veins, glowing faint beneath it. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, arms wrapped around 2 small bundles, clinging to her side's children. Kael didn't recognize the species, not exactly. Uralin, maybe. One of the hybrid strains, judging by the dermal latticework and thin biological tubing around her neck. Genetic augmentation was common post-war, but this was corporate design. He scanned quickly, no obvious weapons. The children were unmoving, still breathing. Kael knelt. Instinct kicked in. His gloved fingers pressed gently against her carotid, then her temple ridges. Alive, just barely. She murmured something, a language he didn't understand fully, but her meaning was universal. Please. That word. That was enough. He didn't decide. He acted. The inner door slid open. Kael pulled them inside one by one, with strength hardened by habit and softened by guilt. As the door sealed and the storm was silenced, the cabin felt louder than ever. Inside, warmth returned slowly. Kael's dome wasn't luxurious barebones, military prefab with failing insulation, and a heat core he repaired monthly with chewing gum and prayer. But it beat death. The woman, thin frost-bitten around the edges, lay curled on the medical cot. Her children, a boy of about 13 and a girl barely half that, wrapped in Kael's spare blankets near the heater unit. He had administered stim patches, rehydration gel, and laid out nutrient packs. He said nothing, not even to himself. His hands worked automatically. His mind fought not to. He had left this behind. The pain of losing patience, the guilt of failing people, the sting of being too late. He could still see her face. Lyra. His daughter's name floated in the sterile air like an accusation. But this wasn't her. This was someone else. 3 someones. Alive. Why were they here? The woman stirred. Her eyes, deep violet like bruised amethyst, met his for a flicker of a second before closing again. The boy watched Kael silently, protective, wary, smart. Kael spoke finally. You're safe, for now. He didn't expect a thank you. He didn't get one. Only more silence. Later that night, Kael sat by the central heater with a worn datapad in hand, pretending to read diagnostics. But his eyes kept drifting. They shouldn't be here. No ships had passed Daranis Theta for months. The nearest hab ring was 5 systems out, and Theta wasn't on any registered refugee corridor, which meant they weren't just lost. They were hiding. That didn't scare Kael. He was hiding too. What did scare him was the look in the woman's eyes. Not fear, not confusion, but exhaustion and expectation. She hadn't knocked for help. She had knocked expecting someone would open the door, and that someone somehow was him. He almost didn't notice it at first, but on the floor near the girl's curled fingers was a folded piece of plastic paper, a child's drawing, three figures, stick-like blue, one tall, two small, a fourth one gray and armored, was standing near them surrounded by stars, and a dome. Kael stared at it for a long time. Did they know him, or worse, were they looking for him? He stood slowly, joints creaking louder than the wind now muffled outside. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know who they really were, but he had let them in. And somehow in this world of ice and regret that felt like the first real decision he had made in years. The storm still howled outside, but inside, someone had knocked, and Kael Varn had answered. Kael didn't sleep that night. The wind's scream softened into a low, hoarse growl against the dome, but inside the silence was heavier than snow. He watched them from his chair near the greenhouse chamber, three strangers lying within the warmth of his exiled peace. The boy was the first to move, not with fear but purpose. He rose quietly, repositioned a thin thermal blanket around the girl, then turned to the cabinet where Kel stored emergency supplies. Hands steady, methodical, he bypassed the obvious food drawers and headed straight for tools. It was how Kael had moved once. At that age, Kel cleared his throat just loud enough. The boy frozen. "You looking for a way out?" Kael said evenly, or something sharp. The boy turned. His face was a mix of hard angles and mistrust. His black hair was slicked from half-dried snow, and his pale blue skin bore faint glowing lines across the cheeks and temples, bioluminescent traces of engineered ancestry. "I was checking," the boy said in clear standard, "for traps." Kael blinked. "Traps for us," the boy replied, holding his ground. "In case you were lying." Kael almost laughed. He didn't. It had been a long time since anything seemed funny. "You think I dragged you and patched up your mother and gave your sister soup just to trap you later?" The boy hesitated but said, "Yes." Kael stared at him for a moment, then gave the tiniest nod. "Fair." An hour later, Kael was boiling nutrient broth again. The heater core buzzed with a faint thrum, kicking uneven warmth into the main chamber. He added a pinch of salted algae, his one luxury. The woman, Sarah, finally stirred awake again. Kael turned medical scanner in hand. "You're not dying," he said flatly. "Yet." Sarah didn't answer. Her violet eyes scanned the dome interior, as if searching for exits, threats, or maybe memories. The girl, still curled up, let out a sleepy sigh. The boy sat beside her now, between Kael and his family, like a wall. Kael kneeled next to Sarah's cot. "You're Uralin." She nodded slowly, voice dry. "Half. Augment." "Biolattice is clean," Kael muttered. "No trackers. Smart." She flinched, not from his words but from recognition. "You scanned us. I don't bring strangers into my dome without scanning them." "We didn't ask to be brought in." Kael stood. "Didn't ask to knock either." The question lingered. Then her lips twitched. Not a smile. Something more bitter. More tired. "No." By midday, the storm eased just enough for power to stabilize. Kael left them resting and climbed the narrow maintenance ladder to inspect the solar junction, half buried under frost. The cold bit through his gloves. That was the thing about Theta. It always reminded you that life was temporary. Skin, memory, machines. Everything failed out here, sooner or later. When he returned, Sarah was upright, sitting on the cot like a soldier awaiting orders. Her posture is perfect, hands folded, dignified despite the borrowed thermal robe. She looked at him, then not just saw, but looked and asked, "What do you want from us?" Kael blinked. The directness caught him off guard. It had been a while since anyone asked him anything without expectation. "Nothing." Sarah didn't believe him. He could see it in her jawline, taut beneath skin too cold for softness. "I've known humans who take in people like us. They always want something." Kael sat across from her, adjusting the cracked crate he used as a chair. "Not all humans." Sarah studied him. "But you're not here by accident either. You don't live on a failed rock like this unless you're hiding something." Kael shrugged. "Maybe I'm hiding from people who ask too many questions." A silence passed. Not hostile, not comfortable either. "I'm Sarah," she said at last. That's Rin. The little one is Luma. Kael didn't reply with his name. He simply stood up and walked toward the greenhouse door. My name doesn't matter, he said over his shoulder, but I assume you like your tea strong. He heard a small exhale behind him, perhaps the closest she had come to laughing in months. Later that evening, Kael found the locket again. It wasn't lost, just hidden beneath the greenhouse paneling where he had buried it under a bag of nutrient soil in denial. But something in the way Rin had stood watch last night had reminded him of her, Lyra. She had that same look when she was 6 and wanted to go outside in the middle of a Martian dust storm. I'm not scared, Daddy. I just don't want the dust to be lonely. Kael opened the locket. The photo was static damage, but he still remembered every contour. Her cheekbones, her missing front tooth, the bright orange scarf that looked ridiculous and perfect. She had died on Earth while he was deployed to Gamma Reach. Too far, too late. His only daughter had been gone for 5 years now. Sarah found him near midnight standing by the dome's outer wall, gazing at the stormlit sky. She didn't say anything at first. Neither did he. Eventually, she stepped beside him. You've lost someone. It wasn't a question. Kael nodded. A lot of someone's. She didn't push. He didn't deflect. It was in its own quiet way, the most honest conversation either had held in years. As Sarah turned to leave, she hesitated. Thank you for letting us in. Kael didn't look at her. You knocked. And what if you hadn't opened the door? He let the silence hold for a moment, then finally answered. Then I wouldn't have heard anything but wind again. She paused, just long enough to say everything she didn't say. Then she returned to her children. Kael remained by the wall, locket in hand, wind whispering against steel. For the first time in years, he realized he hadn't been alone when the storm came. He'd just been waiting for someone else to hear it too. Morning came with frost clinging to every surface like breath held too long. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the silence, woven into the chill that crept through the dome's imperfect seals. Kael Varn stood in the greenhouse chamber, staring at a cracked irrigation pipe, steam hissing faintly from where the recycled water was already freezing again. He didn't fix it. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to the main room where the 3 strangers still slept, or pretended to. Sarah's breathing was too deliberate, the boy's stillness too rigid. Only the girl Luma seemed truly asleep, curled in a nest of old blankets, with a thumb near her mouth and her small chest rising and falling like a song forgotten. Kael crouched and retrieved the plastic paper drawing from the night before. Luma's work. There were 4 stick figures now, the same 3 blue-skinned ones, mother, son, daughter, and the gray-armored figure again. The dome in the background had a tree growing beside it. Impossible. There were no trees on Daranis Theta. Not anymore. But children didn't draw impossibilities. They drew what they needed to be true. Kael folded the paper neatly and placed it on the console. By midday, Sarah was moving better. She had swapped the robe for an old mining vest Kael had hung near the decon chamber. It didn't fit perfectly, but it allowed her to move with quiet strength. She cleaned the empty nutrient packs, sorted the cracked utensils, and scanned the room without asking questions, but taking everything in. The boy Rin hadn't spoken again since the night before. He followed Kael like a shadow, not out of admiration, but scrutiny. Kael didn't mind. It reminded him of the rookies in his old unit. Suspicious eyes were the first step toward trust. Luma, however, followed no such pattern. She woke with the sunlight and shuffled toward the greenhouse door, barefoot, giggling softly at the little frost crystals forming on the windows. Kael found her tracing circles in the condensation. He tapped the panel beside her, raising the internal temperature 2 degrees. Careful, he said. It's still cold enough to take fingers. She turned, looked up at him, and smiled like she didn't believe in fingers falling off. I dreamed of sunlight, she whispered. Kael blinked. There's no sunlight here. She just pointed at the frosted glass. It was warm, though, like soup. Later that day, Rin finally broke the silence. Kael was soldering a power coupler by the wall grid when the boy stepped close and said, Why are you alone? Kael didn't look up. Because being with people hurts more. Rin tilted his head, visibly chewing on that. And you brought us in anyway. Kael nodded once. Because not bringing you in would have hurt worse. A pause. You're not like the others, Rin said. Kael finally glanced up. What others? The ones that wore the white suits, with needles. They smiled when they lied. Kael's jaw tightened. You were in a lab. Rin's eyes flickered. They called it a shelter. Kael knew the type. Corporate bioclinics pretending to be refugee sanctuaries. Research wrapped in mercy. It was common after the war, especially with alien hybrids. Test study extract. And if a subject had valuable genetic material, they didn't leave. Your sister Kael asked quietly. Is she? She's fine now. Rin cut in quickly defensive. But they took blood. Every week. She got tired. Kael stared at the floor. I used to work in a place like that, he said. Rin's mouth opened in shock. Not by choice, Kael added. A silence passed between them, raw and unfinished. I tried to stop it, Kael murmured. Failed. Rin didn't say anything else. But when Kael looked back, the boy had placed his soldering tool in Kael's tray. Like an offering. Like forgiveness. In the following days, something shifted. Rin stopped trailing Kael out of suspicion and started doing so out of curiosity. He asked about the reactor core, about the water filters, about why the greenhouse light was red-shifted instead of full spectrum. Kael answered with the quiet patience of a man surprised to still care about explaining things. Sarah, meanwhile, kept her distance, not in body, but in emotion. She helped. She cleaned. She cooked in her own minimalist way, using nutrient paste Kael would have otherwise left to expire. She made it edible, almost pleasant, but she spoke only when necessary, and only in statements, never questions, until she found the burned medical patches in Kael's waste bin. Combat medic, she said flatly, holding one up. Kael didn't deny it. Second Reconciliation War, he replied. 73rd Terran Field Division. Her eyes narrowed. That's where the casualties were worst, which is why I left. You deserted. He looked at her. I survived. Her gaze didn't soften, but it stopped judging. I lost someone there too, she said. Kael waited. My mate, taken during extraction. They said he resisted. But I know better. She looked down at her hands. They never ask you to comply. They just assume you will. Kael spoke softly. They always call it mercy, never theft. That night she sat closer to him than before. Not beside him, but closer. The next morning, Luma placed a new drawing on Kael's console. This time the tree beside the dome had leaves. Blue ones. She pointed at it and whispered, That's what it looks like on the inside. Kael didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. He'd started to feel it too. Something was growing here. Not from soil, but from silence. Shared silence. And warmth that didn't come from the heater core. The snow came back 2 days later, quieter this time, as if ashamed of its last tantrum. It sifted across the dome in fine whispering waves. Inside, the world had changed again. Kael found himself humming, not loudly, just under his breath, a tune with no name, something Lyra used to hum when they baked ration bread together on the Martian outpost. She'd called it the bread dance. He hadn't thought of it in years. He didn't realize he was humming it until Luma started swaying near the heater, spinning in slow circles like a drifting leaf. She giggled when she caught him watching. You have music in your chest, she whispered. Kael grunted, half smiling. Don't tell anyone. Ruins the reputation. Rin looked up from the power core schematic he'd been memorizing. What reputation? Kael raised an eyebrow. That I'm grumpy and emotionally unavailable. You are grumpy, Rin muttered. Kael tossed him a ration bar. It hit his shoulder. Rin didn't flinch, just caught it on the bounce and cracked a rare grin. Sarah had taken over the greenhouse with surgical precision. She wasn't interested in flowers, but yield ratios, moisture condensation levels, optimal nutrient mix for hybrid tubers. That was her battlefield. Kael let her. She didn't ask for permission. You know, he said, watching her program a pH stabilizer with an intensity most people reserve for emergency surgeries, you could have been a hydro engineer. Sarah didn't look up. I was. Before they reassigned me to what she paused. Reproduction. Kael said nothing for a long time. They didn't need my skills, she continued. They needed viable genome carriers. Because of your bloodline, because of my mates. She wiped condensation off the seedling panel. After he died, they said I was state property, that I owed them the future. Kyle's jaw clenched. He'd heard it before. Variations of it. The quiet horror hidden in bureaucracy and bioethics committees. Words like donation and legacy used to mask captivity. "That's why you ran?" he asked. "No," Sarah said softly. "I ran when they started asking for Luma." Kael breathed out slowly. The pieces were coming together now. The way Sarah had knocked with urgency, not hope. The way she kept her children close, even in sleep. The silent fury in her voice when she said the word shelter. They hadn't just escaped. They had survived systemic predation. And yet, they were planting carrots now. That evening, Kael found Luma in the comms room, which was, to be fair, just a table with a broken long-range transmitter and a cracked screen. Still, she had managed to wedge her crayon into the console's seams, drawing loops and stars around the edges like it was a temple. He watched quietly for a moment. "What are you doing?" She looked up unbothered, making it friendlier. "It's a broken transmitter." Luma nodded seriously. "Then it needs the most help." Kael knelt beside her. "When I was your age," he said, "I tried to fix a broken radio with chewing gum and copper wire. Did it work?" "No, but I convinced my father it did. He thought I could talk to the moon." Luma giggled. Then after a pause, she asked the kind of question only children ask without flinching. "Did you lose someone?" Kael swallowed. "Yes." "Were they little?" "She was," he said. "Like you." Luma nodded solemnly, then reached into her blanket pouch and pulled out a folded drawing. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "This is you, but not alone anymore." Kael unfolded it. The dome, the tree, the four figures again, but this time there were more, tiny ones, in the background, approaching from the snow. He looked at her. "Why are there more people now?" She smiled gently. "Because that's what's supposed to happen when someone makes soup and lets people in." Kael blinked. Somewhere deep in his chest, something cracked. Not painfully, just quietly. Later that night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the console, the drawing beside him. His locket beside that. Two halves of a past he couldn't change and a future he hadn't meant to build. He turned on the old transmitter not to send anything, but just to hear the static. Then he did something strange. He spoke into it. "This is Dome 12 on Daranis Theta. Nothing urgent. Just soup's warm. If you're close." It wasn't a call for help. It wasn't even a signal. It was a permission slip for someone somewhere to come back from whatever frost had buried them. The next morning, Rin handed Kael a set of thermal sealants. "You're running out of wall patches," he said. Kael blinked. "You organizing inventory now?" "Someone has to." Kael almost smiled. "You know, he said you're a pain in the ass." Rin shrugged. "You're old. It balances out." Kael chuckled, then paused. "You want me to teach you the dome systems?" Rin looked up, guarded at first. Then slowly he nodded. "Yeah. Okay." Sarah watched from the greenhouse doorway. She didn't speak, but Kael saw her nod too. Just once. Like something had been quietly accepted between them. That night, as the snow fell like feathers over the dome, Kael stared out the viewport. Luma had added stars to the glass with her finger. He didn't know if they were real or imagined. Didn't care. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was sharing survival. And that was something else entirely. Snow can bury bodies, sure, but guilt that buries deeper. And unlike snow, it doesn't melt when the sun comes back. Kael knew this better than anyone. He sat on the old metal crate, tuning the water recycler for the 5th time that week. The system didn't need fixing. He just needed something that rattled, something mechanical, something predictable. Machines didn't ask questions. They didn't remember your mistakes. But people drew you in with quiet smiles and stories that smelled like warmth. Like Sarah. She had become part of the dome now. Not an intruder, not even a guest. Just a fixture like the heater core or the cracked coffee mug Kael still refused to throw away. And that made it harder, because Kael had started to like her, not in the way he had once loved. That part of him was buried with Lyra. But there was something in the way Sarah sat with her, back straight, eyes tired but unyielding, always folding towels no one asked her to. Like she needed order to exist. Like if she didn't keep moving, the past might catch her again. He recognized that rhythm. It was his too. It was Sarah who broke the quiet that evening. Cal was adjusting the thermal vent under the dining slab when her voice cut in soft, clear, like something pressed against the inside of a jar too long. "I know your name now." Cal turned, wiping his hands. "Oh, Rin found your old medic tag in the greenhouse soil cache." Cal didn't speak. He just waited. "You were Kael Varn," she said, like she was repeating a long-forgotten incantation. 73rd, Terran medic, commendation for field rescue on Delta Rhine. That was a long time ago. "And Lyra," she added quieter, "now is your daughter." Kael froze, something in his chest twisted, not from anger, but exposure. "I didn't tell him to look," she said, "but I didn't stop him either." Kael nodded slowly. "You should have burned it." "Why? Because it doesn't help." Sarah stepped closer, her shadow reaching his boots. "Luma's blood," she said. "You recognized the markers, didn't you?" Kyle closed his eyes. "Yes," Sarah inhaled sharply. "You worked on the enzyme, didn't you? The one that made extraction safe." "I tried," Kyle said. "We failed. Children kept dying in trials. My daughter needed the treatment too, but we never synthesized it in time." He didn't need to say the rest. She was already gone by the time I got home. I held her hand. It was cold. Sarah stood in silence. She didn't touch him, didn't console him, but she didn't leave either. "You weren't the one who hurt them," she said. "You tried to save them." Kyle stared at the floor. "I made it worse." "No," she replied, her voice steeped beneath sadness. "You gave people like me a reason to believe someone inside the system cared. That was enough to run." Kael looked up surprised. Sarah met his gaze without blinking. "That's why I knocked." That night, Kael sat by the old radio again. The storm outside had grown claws once more, and every gust sounded like a scream smothered by snow. He switched the transmitter on, nothing but static, but still he whispered, "If anyone's listening, I've got soup again." Then he added more quietly, "And maybe a reason to share it." Rin approached him later, holding something strange, a rusted comm unit Kael had junked weeks ago. "I fixed it," Rin said. "I mean, I think I did. No guarantees." Kael turned it over in his hands. The solder points were messy, but they held. A new battery had been rigged from an old heater coil, and etched into the casing, barely legible, was a name, Lyra. Kael looked up stunned. Rin shrugged. "You dropped it when we first came in. I thought maybe it was important." Kyle didn't speak. Didn't need to. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder, just for a moment. The kid didn't pull away. The next day, Luma drew again. This time the stick figures were holding hands. Kyle, Sarah, Rin, Luma. The tree had fruit, blue and red. Kyle pointed. "What kind of fruit is that?" Luma smiled. "The kind that grows when you let people stay." He stared at the picture longer than he meant to. And for the first time since Theta became his grave of choice, he whispered something he hadn't dared in years. "I hope it's sweet." Sarah came to him that evening with a question. Not an accusation, not a warning, just a quiet question. "If they come looking again," she asked, "will you let us run?" Kyle didn't hesitate. "No." She tensed. But then he added, "Because you won't have to." Her expression cracked, and in its place something else bloomed. Not gratitude, not relief. Something deeper, like faith. And Kel, for the first time, didn't feel like an intruder in his own dome. The moment Kel noticed the smear of red beneath Luma's nose, time didn't stop, it folded. It happened in the smallest of ways, a giggle, a stumble, a single drop of blood wiped on her sleeve as she twirled barefoot past the hydro trays. Innocent, harmless, a child being a child. But to Kael it was a siren. "Hold still," he said, voice low, already reaching for the handheld scanner, out of habit, not panic. Never panic. He hadn't panicked in years. That was the problem. The first reading blinked confusedly, an anomalous compound detected. Kyle frowned and adjusted the spectrum. Could be interference, could be leftover nutrients, could be no. He recalibrated the scan. There it was again, an enzymatic signature, coiled and intricate, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten like a vice. No, not just familiar, haunting. Kael pulled up the display projecting the full molecular structure. and it hit him like an old war injury you thought healed until one morning it didn't. Delta E, the enzyme that never existed, at least not in a way that mattered, not in time. His throat closed, his vision blurred. He dropped the scanner onto the bench and stared at the profile, the numbers burning holes in his memory. Sarah entered moments later, drawn by the silence. She saw Kael's face before the screen and froze. "What is it?" He didn't look up. Just whispered, "She has it. Has what? Delta E," he said. Now he looked at her like a man who had just seen a ghost and wasn't sure if he wanted to believe in it again. "She's producing Delta E, naturally, endogenously. Perfect confirmation." Sarah's breath hitched. "That's not possible," Kael laughed. "Just once. It sounded like it hurt. That's what we used to say too." Years ago, Kael had led a medical research team in the Outer Rim. The war had left thousands of hybrid children vulnerable to rejection syndromes, diseases born from the collision of gene-mod tech and war-borne bioweapons. The only hope had been a binding enzyme, something that could teach alien blood and human systems to cooperate, something they named Delta E, and every version of it failed. Too unstable, too short-lived, too late. Lyra had needed it. Kael had truly believed, that he could finish the formula in time, that he could bring it home. He didn't. She died in hospice, alone, because he chased a ghost molecule across star maps instead of holding her hand. Now, years later, a little girl had stumbled through his door and bled the very thing he couldn't save his daughter with. "You understand what this means," Sarah said, stepping beside him, hands clenched. "This is why they wanted her. Not just to harvest, to own, to replicate." Kael didn't answer. He was staring at the scan again, rerunning the structure through a dozen predictive simulations, every single one coming back perfect. "You said you worked on this," Sarah continued. "You were that Kael Varn." "I buried that name," he said. "Didn't help anyone." Sarah's voice was low, trembling, but sharp. "It helped me. When I escaped that facility, I remembered reading about someone in the Terran Corps who tried to stop the synth labs from testing on civilians. They court-martialed you for interfering with corporate trials." "I disobeyed," Kael muttered. "So they erased me, and I followed the stories anyway," she said. "That's why I came here." Kael looked up. "You came here looking for me?" "No," Sarah said softly. "I came here hoping someone like you still existed." That night, Kael couldn't sleep. He sat by the green glow of the hydroponic lights, Luma's file open beside him, the sequence blinking quietly like a second heartbeat. She was sleeping in the next room, peaceful, unaware of what flowed through her like a secret encoded by the stars themselves. He could barely breathe. Delta E wasn't just real, it had a name now. Luma. When morning broke, he found Rin seated near the tool chest, fixing a snap terminal cable with sharp, precise fingers. The boy barely glanced up. "She's okay, right?" he asked. Kael nodded slowly. "She's more than okay." Rin studied him. "You look like someone just handed you a second chance." Kael sat beside him, eyes distant. "Maybe she did." Later, Luma tugged at his coat. "Mr. Kael," she whispered. He knelt. She placed a drawing in his palm. Another one. This time it wasn't the dome. Not a tree. Not stars. It was a girl with orange hair, and in her hand, a glowing apple. Luma pointed to her. "She told me to give this to you, in my dream." Kael's throat locked. That was Lyra's scarf. That was her apple. "She said," Luma whispered, "it's your turn to stay." Kael didn't move. He couldn't. The drawing trembled in his hands. Somewhere Lyra's memory stopped being a wound and started becoming a doorway. It started with a hiss, a tiny release of air no louder than a sigh, but enough to make Sarah flinch. She had been reaching for a storage crate in the greenhouse, elbow deep in rerouted nutrient tubes, when the cuff around her wrist sparked and gave way. The soft blue lights embedded in the band blinked out. Kael, watching from across the room, recognized the problem before she even turned. "Microfracture in the seal?" he asked. Sarah glanced at him. Her eyes were unreadable, but her arm stayed lifted, frozen mid-motion, like a machine waiting to fail. "It's nothing." Kael stood. "You're leaking heat from the nerve plate. That band's half the reason you're not shivering in your bones right now." She lowered her gaze. "I can fix it." Kael raised an eyebrow. "With what, duct tape and determination that earned the tiniest twitch at the corner of her mouth. He wasn't sure if it was annoyance or amusement. Either way, he took a step closer and extended his hand. Let me. Sarah hesitated for a second too long. Trust was always slow with people like them, scarred, displaced, wired for retreat. But finally she extended her wrist. Kael worked in silence. His hands were steady practiced. A soldier's touch softened by years of trying to save what bullets couldn't. He pulled open the clasp, exposed the internal circuitry, and whistled softly. Biomimetic mesh. Pre-union tech, he muttered. This wasn't cheap. Sarah replied quietly, It belonged to my mate. I adapted it after they took him. Kael didn't comment. He just nodded, soldering a tiny strand of copper filament into place. A spark jumped. The lights flickered back to life. There, he said. It'll hold. Sarah flexed her fingers. The glow stabilized. For a moment she looked almost surprised, like something she had stopped believing in reliability had just whispered back to life. Thank you, she said softly. Kael shrugged, already packing the tools. Just fixing what needs fixing. But it was more than that. They both knew it. Later that evening, Kael cooked again. Real food, not paste. Not ration bars crushed into something that pretended to be meat. This was soup. Honest, warm, and seasoned with just a hint of ground herbs from the hydroponic tubes. It filled the dome with a scent Kael hadn't smelled since Earth Comfort. He ladled the soup into 4 mismatched bowls and set them on the crate table with clumsy reverence. Eat before it cools, he grumbled. Rin looked skeptical. Sarah looked cautious. Only Luma beamed like soup was treasure. They ate in silence at first, but it was a good silence. Not wary, not tense, just shared. A silence made of steam and slurps and the crackle of something thawing inside their collective ribs. Halfway through her bowl, Sarah spoke. My real name, she said, was coded Sarah Unit 9N Helix. They assigned it when I was bioclassified for procreation protocols. Kael didn't look up. I chose to keep Sarah, she added, because I wanted to reclaim something. Kael nodded slowly. You're more than what they coded. Sarah looked across the table. And you? What do you reclaim? Kael didn't answer at first, just stirred his soup. Soup, apparently. Sarah smiled, not a smirk, a real small smile. And just like that, another crack appeared in their emotional armor. The days that followed were quieter but not cold. Kael found himself lingering longer at the table. Rin, too, began asking more about wiring protocols. Luma insisted on drawing pictures of their meals. Her latest was a bowl with stars in it. It's galaxy soup, she said. It makes people stay. Kael stared at that drawing longer than he should have. Maybe she was right. Maybe warmth wasn't a defense. Maybe it was an invitation. One night, Sarah brought out a worn data patch, encrypted and half-corrupted its contents, mostly fragmented. She slid it across the table toward Kael. It's all I salvaged from the facility, she said. Notes, genetic files, some logs. Kael stared at the device like it might burn him. I want you to have it, she continued. If anyone can understand what they did to her, it's you. He took the patch with careful fingers. Their hands brushed. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. Later, as the dome dimmed into night, Kael sat outside the sleeping quarters alone with his thoughts and a half-finished repair schematic. Sarah stepped out from the greenhouse. Her silhouette is framed by green-tinted light, quiet and deliberate. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him. They didn't speak, didn't need to. It was a new silence now, no longer made of grief and suspicion, but of presence and soup and something dangerously close to belonging. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Kael didn't feel like a failure trying to survive someone else's absence. He felt like a man still here because someone else had dared to stay. The dome was never quiet, not truly. There was always the low hum of recycled air, the creak of temperature fluctuations in the steel, and the faint tick-tick-tick of Kael's solar array struggling to stay relevant against the snow-choked sky. But lately it has started to sound different. Not quieter, just softer. Like the space itself had learned to exhale. Kael stood in the greenhouse with a repair light clamped between his teeth elbows, deep in the nutrient intake valve. The hydroponic system had been failing, again refusing to regulate moisture levels on the east-facing beds. Standard for Theta. Nothing lived here unless it was made to, and even then most things changed their mind. But when he turned the last valve, realigned the flow, and heard that rare trickle of water moving cleanly, he smiled. A real one. Behind him, tiny footsteps padded across the grated floor. "Is it working now?" Luma's voice was gentle as always but laced with awe. Kael removed the light from his mouth and nodded. "Should be. Want to test it?" She stepped beside him without hesitation, standing on tiptoe to reach the edge of the bed. Her tiny finger poked into the damp soil. "It's warmer," she said. "The plants will feel it." Kael chuckled. "Plants can't feel anything." Luma tilted her head. "That's what people said about you." He blinked and didn't reply. That afternoon, Rin helped Kael reinforce the greenhouse wall, patching a crack where the sealant had warped. Kael let the boy hold the thermal coil, guiding his hands carefully, patiently, as the weld hissed and smoked. "You ever think we'll grow real food?" Rin asked. Kael shrugged. "We've got tuber sprouts and protocale. That's close enough." Rin shook his head. "No, I mean like fruit, apples, berries, things with color." Kael paused. "When I was younger, he said my daughter tried to plant a pear tree in our hydro unit. It didn't matter that we didn't have the right climate, right nutrients. She just believed it would work." He smiled at the memory, bittersweet as it was. "I told her it would die. What happened? She planted it anyway." Kael looked away. It grew. Later, as twilight bled across the dome's upper vents, Sarah stepped into the greenhouse and saw something that stopped her. Color. Just a flicker of green, a few brave leaves curling out from the hydro beds. The nutrient trays were no longer lifeless puddles, they shimmered with possibility. She watched as Kael gently adjusted the light levels, not saying a word. Rin was placing small reflective mirrors around the soil bed, his own idea, Kael had told her. Luma was humming. For a moment, Sarah didn't recognize herself in the reflection on the dome's curved wall. She looked still, as if the wind inside her had finally stopped blowing. Later, over a shared meal of broth and sliced root stem, still not quite food, but getting there, Luma set down her spoon and asked, "Can we name the tree?" Kael raised an eyebrow. "It's not really a tree yet, just a sprout." "But it wants to be," she said firmly. Kael looked at Sarah, who gave a helpless little shrug. "Well," he said, "I suppose it needs a name." Luma thought hard, then declared, "We should call it Lyra." The air thinned. Kael didn't move. Sarah froze her spoon halfway to her mouth. Rin looked down. "She came to me in a dream again," Luma said, calm. "She said she likes soup. She said trees are made of memory." Kael exhaled slowly and nodded. "Lyra it is." That night he found Sarah outside the greenhouse, hands tucked under her arms, staring at the skyless white beyond the dome's edge. "It's strange," she said, "the way something can start to grow without permission." Kael stood beside her. "Things don't ask to live. They just do." And sometimes, Sarah said, they start again, even after they were told they couldn't. He said nothing, but he was thinking of Lyra, of Luma, of this place, and how it had gone from a grave to a greenhouse. In the quiet moments before sleep, Kael wrote something down in an old logbook he hadn't touched in years. Status: greenhouse stable. Name of first sprout: Lyra. Reason for success: unknown. Suspected cause: hope. They heard it before they saw it. A low-pitched whine, too steady to be wind, too mechanical to be natural. The kind of sound that crawled beneath skin, familiar in the way old fears often are. Kael looked up from the soil basin just as the greenhouse lights flickered. Sarah stood frozen by the irrigation node, her posture no longer relaxed, no longer present. She was listening. "Was that yes?" she cut in. Kael didn't need to ask again. He rushed to the dome's rear access port, climbed the narrow ladder to the elevated observation slit, and looked out across the blinding white. At first there was nothing, just snow. But then he saw it small, black, moving in staccato pulses against the sky. A drone. Standard recon class. Too small to carry weapons, too fast to be wildlife. But it wasn't the model that chilled him. It was the insignia. Faint but there. A four-pronged spiral, etched in red. Helix Corp. Kael dropped down the ladder fast. They found us. Sarah was already checking Luma's breathing, holding her daughter tightly. Rin grabbed the toolbox and slung it over his shoulder, even though his hands were shaking. They won't send a drone unless Kael started. Unless they're already inbound. Sarah finished. Kael turned to her. We have hours. Maybe. He opened the weapons locker. There wasn't much. 2 pulse pistols, half a charge each. 1 flare gun. A thermal blade he hadn't touched since Theta's second winter. Nothing that could stop a full squad, but this time Kael wasn't planning on stopping them. He was planning on revealing them. Sarah followed him to the comm station. This won't help, she said. They'll jam any signal. Not if we bounce it through the old relay towers. Those towers are offline. They're old, not dead. Kael slid Luma's drawing off the comm console carefully and set it aside. He powered up the transmitter. Static hissed through the room. Rin hovered behind him, eyes wide. What are you doing? Kael didn't turn. His fingers moved like they had a decade ago inputting long-abandoned override codes into the uplink node. Sending proof, he muttered. Letting people know what she is. Why do they want her? But that'll make us a target, Sarah said. Kael looked up. We already are. The drone passed overhead again, lower this time. A soft buzz rattled the dome's vents. Luma curled up under the table, silent but shaking. Rin knelt beside her, hand resting on her shoulder. Sarah moved to Kael's side. You don't have to do this alone. Kael met her eyes. I'm not. And just like that, something old snapped in half, and something new stood in its place. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was defending. They initiated the signal spike during the next whiteout. The storm gave them cover, but also risk. Snow shorted the antenna twice, and the generator surged dangerously close to burnout. Kael patched it mid-transmission, cursing between frozen breaths, while Rin fed a new power cell into the uplink stabilizer. The relay signal flickered, then locked. Kael's voice, rough and clipped, began broadcasting to the wider grid. This is Kael Varn, Terran Medical Officer, transmitting from Daranis Theta. We have a live subject with endogenous Delta E. Repeat, Delta E. Subject is a minor. Pursued by Helix Corp Black Ops. Evidence attached. He uploaded the encrypted med file. Pause, then added, if you're human, if you still give a damn, don't let them disappear her. He cut the signal, then turned to the others. Now they waited. The next morning, everything looked normal. No soldiers, no ships, just snow. As if the drone had never existed. Kael knew better. That was the worst part about Helix Corp. They made silence feel safe. Sarah stood by the outer seal cloak, pulled tight around her shoulders. They're watching, she said. Yes. They'll wait for us to make a mistake. Kael nodded. We won't. She turned to him. There was no fear in her eyes now. Just resolve. They'll come. Kael stepped closer. Then we welcome them properly. He installed a new motion trigger on the outer perimeter. Rin helped. Luma painted new stars on the walls. Sarah built a hidden cache of nutrient packs beneath the greenhouse floor. It wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a trap. It was something more dangerous. A home. And if Helix Corp came knocking again, this time the door wouldn't open. Not out of fear, but because they had something to protect now. Not just a miracle child, but a life that mattered, and a garden that refused to die. The day passed without sirens, without drones, without blood. But the quiet pressed in sharper than gunfire. Kael stood at the edge of the greenhouse that morning, arms folded, eyes scanning the horizon through the fogged viewport. He expected movement, a shimmer of motion behind the wind, the telltale crunch of boots over permafrost. Anything, but nothing came, and that was worse. Helix Corp didn't break down doors. They waited. Let silence dig its claws in first. Let uncertainty rot resolve from the inside. They didn't take what you loved with fire and bullets. They made you give it up yourself. Inside, Rin was tinkering again, this time with the old mining drone Kael had decommissioned years ago. The boy had repurposed it, turning the hull into a basic perimeter bot. It couldn't shoot, but it could ping. Record. Listen. Kael watched him from the hallway. You know, he said softly, when I was your age, I thought war was about weapons. Rin didn't look up. It's not. Kael knelt beside him. No, it's about what people won't give up. Rin adjusted a sensor plate. Then we already won. Kael didn't answer, but something in his chest agreed. Sarah found Kael in the comm room staring at the blank transmitter. The message had been sent. Still no response. "I'm not sure they'll come," she said quietly. Kael looked over. The council, anyone. Everyone. People hear the truth, and most still choose silence. Kael tapped the console with one finger. "I'm not waiting for them to rescue us." "Then what are we waiting for?" Kael turned to her, voice low but steady. "For the moment we choose not to run." That evening, the four of them sat around the heater core again. Soup, crackers. Luma had drawn eyes on the side of her bowl and named it Commander Broth. She saluted before every sip. Kael smiled, not because it was funny, but because the girl wasn't afraid, and he wanted to keep it that way. Rin recited the latest system upgrades with uncharacteristic pride, how the drone could now triangulate based on sound. Sarah listened, one hand resting gently over Luma's, who had started braiding string into a bracelet. Kael reached over and placed his comm link on the table. "If they come," he said, "we don't fight." Sarah's brows lifted. "We surrender." "No," Kael said. "We refuse." He leaned forward. "They want control, not confrontation. They want to own her. Don't kill her." Rin frowned. "So what do we do?" Kael looked at him. "We stay." The word fell like a stone into water and rippled outward. The next morning, Kael placed a small sign outside the dome. It was primitive, etched by hand on salvage plating. No weapons, no threats, just words. "This place is claimed, not by war, by willingness." The following day, a drone returned. It hovered at high altitude scanning. Kael stood outside in full view, Sarah beside him, Rin and Luma just inside the airlock. He held nothing. No gun, no flag, just himself. The drone paused, beeped, moved on. They didn't breach the dome, didn't burn it, didn't land. They weren't ready for this kind of resistance. Inside, Luma asked what would happen next. Kael crouched beside her. "We make it harder for them to pretend we don't exist," Sarah added, "and easier for others to find us." Rin stepped forward, holding up a reconfigured beacon. This transmits a soft pulse every cycle. Scrambled, masked, but real. Kael smiled. "Good. Let's make noise without shouting." At night, Kael stood by the viewport again. The storm was fading. The sky showed its first glimpse of starlight in weeks. Beside him, Sarah leaned against the steel frame. "They'll come back." "Yes," Kael said. "And when will they do it?" Kael didn't look away. "We'll still be here." He took a breath. "I used to think protecting someone meant building walls. Now I know it's standing with them when the walls come down." Sarah didn't reply. She didn't have to. Her fingers brushed his hand. Light, quiet, certain. No declaration, no romance. Just a pact. Reclamation doesn't always come with fire. Sometimes it comes with soup soil and a broken man who stayed. Morning on Daranis Theta wasn't marked by sunlight. There were no golden rays pushing through shutters, no bird song, no warmth bleeding into chilled walls. Instead, it arrived as a gradual fading of black into a dull gray, a slow shift of shadow. On most days, Kael welcomed it. Darkness was too honest, too heavy. Daylight, if it could be called, that carried with it the illusion of safety, of pause. But not today. Today the quiet felt dangerous. He rose before the others as he always did. Boots slid silently across the metal flooring that groaned with age. He checked systems in order: greenhouse humidity, solar capacitor. Readouts, the low hum of water cycling through warm tubes. All normal, all functioning. Too normal. The outside world hadn't stirred for hours. Not since the last drone passed overhead 2 days ago, vanishing beyond the horizon without another trace. Since then, no signals, no movement, not even static on the comms band. Kael stood at the dome's narrow viewport, the one overlooking the western ridge. What he saw chilled him more than the frost stillness. No snow falling, no wind crawling across the ice flats, no low-humming engines echoing in the distance. Just silence. The eye of the storm isn't always the worst part, he thought. It's what follows. Down the corridor, Rin was already awake, his body curled near the hydro heater with the comm relay in pieces on the floor. The boy hadn't said much since the signal pinged days ago. A broken transmission. Just a few words fragmented. Receive transmission, Delta E, hold, and then nothing. It could have been from anyone. A warship, a corporate interceptor, a rebel node, or something worse. Kael had listened to it a dozen times, analyzed the waveform. No return signal. It lingered now in the dome like a ghost, half confirmation, half threat. And Rin had stopped asking when help would arrive. He just worked. Kael found Sarah kneeling in the greenhouse adjusting nutrient levels. Her face was calm, but her shoulders, always straight, always proud, had a new weight to them. Humidity's high, she said without turning. Winter air's thick, Kael replied. They didn't speak about the message. Not yet. Not until someone else did. They shared breakfast quietly. Rehydrated root broth. Luma broke the silence first, as she always did, by humming softly while drawing on the old wall panels with her chalks. Her latest mural was different. No dome, no stars. Just people. Lots of them. All walking towards something glowing in the distance. Is that us? Kael asked, pointing. Luma smiled. No, that's them. Sarah set down her spoon. Them, the ones who are coming. Kael tried to keep his voice light. You saw that in a dream, Luma nodded seriously. The plant told me. Kael chuckled, soft but not mocking. Of course it did. By midday, the comm console still blinked its steady amber glow. No signal, no response. Kael sat before it with one hand resting on the transmitter, the other on his temple. He hadn't shaved in 2 days. His beard was growing in patches. His thoughts were growing worse. Sarah appeared in the doorway. You've been sitting there for an hour. Kael didn't turn. You think it was real? He asked. The signal. She stepped closer, arms crossed, but not guarded. Thoughtful. Yes. Kael sighed. Then why hasn't anyone come? Maybe they have. He looked at her now, and she clarified. Maybe not everyone who hears a cry for help rushes in with guns and banners. Some just listen. That matters too. Kael tilted his head. And maybe some are waiting to see if we survive long enough to be worth the effort. Maybe, Sarah said, but we're still here. That's effort. Rin entered an hour later with the makeshift drone clutched under one arm. I've recalibrated the motion sensors. Trip lines active, heat signature tracking synced with our bio IDs. If anyone lands, it'll ping us before they ping it. Kael nodded, grateful. Then Rin added quietly, I think they're waiting. Kael looked at him. For what? For us to run. The boy's voice was steady, matter of fact. They think we'll panic. Pack up. Leave the girl behind if it gets hard enough. They've seen it before, with other families. Kael frowned. They don't know us. Rin nodded. Let's make sure of that. By late afternoon, the snow returned. Not heavy, just enough to blanket the ground and veil the sky. Kael stood by the outer hatch watching the flakes land on the reinforced dome glass and melt instantly. He reached up and tapped the surface, almost like a question. Sarah came up behind him. You always pace when you're unsure. I'm always unsure, Kael muttered. She smiled faintly. You're always pacing then. They stood in silence for a moment, not touching, not leaning. Just present. Then Kael spoke. If they come, I don't want Luma to see guns. I don't want her to see me like that. She won't, Sarah said. Kael shook his head. You don't know that. No, Sarah replied. But I know she sees you already. Not as a soldier, not as a medic, as someone who opens doors when others knock. Kael blinked, hard. She reached for his hand, held it. No squeeze, just stillness. And in that stillness, something rooted. That night, Luma curled into Kael's side while they sat by the heater. She was quiet at first, drawing. Then she whispered, Do you think they'll be nice? Kael looked down. Who? The people who are coming. He thought for a moment, then answered honestly. I don't know. Luma nodded like she expected that answer. But if they're not, she said, we still have soup. Kael smiled, and maybe that was enough. Hours later, when the dome had quieted again, a ping sounded. Not loud, not urgent, just real. Kael shot up from his cot, stumbled toward the console. Rin followed, eyes wide. Sarah entered from the side, pulling on her coat. Luma clutched a drawing to her chest, half asleep but smiling. The console screen flickered. Incoming signal detected, then static, then a voice. Daranis Theta? Confirmed. Biological carrier matches. Delta E. Priority registry. Request acknowledgement. Kael's heart pounded. The voice was garbled but unmistakably human. Calm. Almost clinical. Government Private Sarah stepped closer. It's a ping, not a warning. Kael nodded slowly. But we don't know who. He reached for the transmitter. Pressed the button. This is Kael Varn, Medical Officer, Terran Corps. Acknowledging. We have a minor hybrid with stabilized Delta E biological origin. No aggression here, only protection. He paused, then added softly, we're not hiding. We're choosing to stay. He released the button. The signal went quiet. Then a flicker, acknowledged. Then nothing. They didn't speak for a long time. The silence was electric. Not fear, readiness. Whatever came next wouldn't be met by a man hiding in a broken dome. It would be met by something harder to erase. Family. Later, Kael returned to the greenhouse where the tomato vine had begun curling upward, grasping toward the red spectrum light like it knew it could grow now. He crouched, touching the soil. Not to fix, not to test, just to feel. Sarah joined him. She didn't say a word. Luma ran up moments later with her drawing. This one showed a ship not sharp or mechanical, but round, soft-edged, almost friendly, hovering just above a house in the snow. Not a dome, a home. They'll come, she said, and we'll let them in. Kael looked at her and smiled. Only, he said, if they knock. The first knock came 3 days later. Not the violent kind. Not the one Kael had spent years anticipating, boots slamming against steel orders, bark through comms walls breached with the efficiency of war. No, this one was soft. A chime from the perimeter motion alert, followed by a blink on the interior panel. Just enough to make Kael glance up from the table where he and Rin had been rewiring the generator regulator. A single heat signature, stationary, waiting. Rin frozen. Kael stood. Sarah arrived seconds later, Luma trailing beside her with chalk-dusted fingers and wide expectant eyes. Kael approached the viewport, slowly, scanner in hand. The reading was faint but clear, a single humanoid figure, unarmed, standing 5 meters from the hatch. No comms, no demand, just presence. He opened the external speaker line, voice steady. This is Dome 12. State your intent. The reply came through a soft-throated voice crackling through the icy wind. My name is Saren Hale. I'm alone. I received your signal. I've been walking for 6 days. I heard what you said about Delta E, about staying. Kael frowned. You're not with Helix Corp. A pause. No, I ran from them. Another silence. May I come in? They let him in, cautiously. Rin kept a hand near the old pistol. Sarah stayed beside Luma, who watched the man curiously. Saren Hale was thin, underfed, wrapped in patched layers of ex-military survival gear. Human, mid-40s, maybe older, eyes sunken but clear. He had the look of someone who had seen too much and chosen somehow not to die from it. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't ask for anything. He just stood there, palms open, staring at Kael like a man standing in front of a myth. I used to work in biogenics, he said. Low-level security. I saw the reports about Delta E trials. We all thought they failed. Then I read the black papers. Kael narrowed his eyes. How did you find us? I didn't. Not really. I followed the ghost of a signal across the rim. I thought it was a trap. Maybe I hoped it was. Why Serene met his gaze? Because I needed to believe that somewhere someone was trying to fix the damage we caused. He looked around the dome and whispered, and here you are. They gave him soup, old habit now. Kael watched Saren eat slowly, spoon trembling. The man wasn't a threat. He wasn't even dangerous. He was, if anything, a reminder of what they had survived, of what was still out there. When the bowl was empty, Saren sat back inside. You're growing food in a grave, he said, and somehow it smells like hope. Kael smiled faintly. It's better than smelling like despair. Over the next week, more came. Not many, not all at once. Just a slow trickle, one here, two there. drawn by the signal Kael had sent by the myth of a child, with miraculous blood by the whisper of a dome that didn't turn people away. Some were hybrid, some augmented, some just scared, some carried children, and Kael let them in, one by one. Not because he wanted to be a savior, but because he knew what it was to knock in the cold and pray someone answered. The dome changed again. Walls were cleaned, cots added, heat redistributed. The greenhouse expanded, new trays, new hands to tend them, new seeds brought from distant corners of the rim. Luma started giving names to the plants, then to the people. "This is Mira," she said, pointing to a sprout. "And this," gesturing to a tall, thin man with mismatched eyes, is Uncle Rusty. "He sings when he thinks no one hears." Kael didn't correct her. He just smiled. Sarah organized the new arrivals into shifts, cooking, maintenance, comms, watch. She was no longer just surviving. She was leading. Rin became the teacher, guiding others through the dome's systems with a quiet confidence Kael hadn't seen before. The boy who once trusted no one now trusted everyone enough to show them where the fuses were. And Luma, she floated, from room to room, person to person, drawing chalk hearts on doorways, leaving notes under bowls. She started calling the greenhouse the Temple of Staying. No one corrected her. They just nodded, because she was right. One night Kael stood alone in the greenhouse. The stars had returned, faint, fractured, through the storm glass, but real. Behind him people laughed, cooked, lived, and beside the tomato vine, now waist-high, stood the first sprout they'd named Lyra. He reached down and touched its leaves. "Hey, little one," he whispered. "Look what you started." Sarah found him there minutes later. She said nothing at first. Then after a long breath, "Do you know what you've done?" Kael looked at her. "I fixed a water line." She laughed quietly. "No. You gave us a place to become ourselves." He looked down. "I didn't plan that." "Exactly," she said. "That's why it worked." He turned to her, and this time when their hands brushed, they didn't stop. They just stood, together. As a knock sounded on the outer hatch, another one, another story, another someone who just needed to be told they could stay. The snow was falling again, but Kael barely noticed. He stood near the greenhouse entrance, his hands coated in nutrient paste, adjusting a new irrigation node that Mira, a recent arrival with steady hands and a fractured leg, had designed using scrap tubing. The dome was louder now, not chaotic but alive. Voices echoed softly from the main corridor, distant laughter, the clink of bowls, a child's question, footsteps padding back and forth on metal grates, no longer fearful. For the first time in years, the dome didn't feel like a place where people hid. It felt like somewhere they belonged. Kael wiped his hands on a rag as he heard small feet scurrying toward him. It was a sound he'd grown used to, like the heartbeat of the place. Luma appeared in the doorway, her arms behind her back, eyes wide and gleaming like violet stars. "I drew something," she declared. Kael crouched down. "Yeah." She pulled out a plastic paper square already crumpled from being carried too tightly. On it, 4 figures, too tall, too short. A dome behind them, trees with bright blue fruit, and at the bottom a single word in big crooked letters, "Home." Kael felt something press behind his ribs, warm and sudden. He smiled. "You've been busy," Luma nodded. "And I have something else." She reached into her coat pocket, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Papa." Kael's breath caught. For a moment he didn't move. He just stared at her like the world had tilted, and he wasn't sure if it was safe to breathe. What did you say?" She looked up serious now, as if testing something fragile and sacred. "I know you're not my real papa," she said, "but you feel like one." Her voice wavered, but her eyes didn't. "So, can I call you that?" Kael opened his mouth. Nothing came out. It wasn't that he was speechless. It was that he didn't have words that could hold what he felt. He swallowed hard, kneeling lower, placing a hand gently over her small shoulder. "Yeah," he said finally, "you can." She beamed, not the way children smile when they get something, the way seeds sprout when they're finally given sunlight. Then she threw her arms around his neck and he let himself be held. Not as a medic, not as a soldier, not even as a protector, but as someone who had finally been named. He carried that name with him the rest of the day like it had weight, like it was made of metal and warmth and memory. Others noticed. Rin, especially. The boy didn't say anything at first, he just watched Kael with a quiet calculation, as if seeing him for the first time as someone different. By late evening, Rin approached Kael by the dome's power regulator room, carrying something small and battered. It was a comm device, old, rusted, cracked down one side. Kael recognized it instantly. It was his, one he had thrown into the corner of the greenhouse months ago, back when he thought nobody could hear him scream. "I found this when we first arrived," Rin said, holding it out. Kael took it slowly, frowning. "I thought I scrapped it." "You tried, but I kept it. Figured it meant something." Kael turned it over in his hand. The screen was shattered, the signal port half melted from frost. It had never really worked, not when he needed it to. Not when Lyra's voice had been on the other end. "I was going to fix it," Rin said. "But then I realized—" He hesitated. "You don't need to call anyone anymore." Kael raised an eyebrow. "No," Rin shrugged. "They're already here." Kael looked down at the comm again. He didn't argue. Didn't try to pretend it was just junk. He slipped it into his coat pocket like a keepsake. "Thanks," he said. Rin nodded. Then after a pause, "She was right to call you Papa." Kael blinked. Rin didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked back toward the greenhouse, leaving Kael alone with the echo of something he hadn't heard in years. Affirmation. Not from command, not from protocol, but from a child who had seen him rebuild with his hands, his silence, and his choices. Later that night, the dome was full. Not in the physical sense. There was still space, still food, but it was full of warmth, of presence, of stories shared over soup and long silences that no longer weighed like grief. Kael sat beside Sarah on the bench near the solar core. She had one leg stretched out, boots half off, sipping the bitter tea she pretended to enjoy. "She called you Papa," Sarah said softly. Kael stared into his mug. "Yeah. You okay with that?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I think I needed someone to call me something other than medic, or Varn, or the quiet guy with the rifle." Sarah smiled faintly. "It suits you, Papa Varn." He winced. "Don't ruin it." She chuckled. Then after a moment, "She sees you for what you are." "And what's that?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes tired but steady. "A man who stayed." Kael stared at the steam rising from his mug. "You stayed too. I stayed because you did." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. That night, Kael couldn't sleep. He walked the halls of the dome, not as a patrol, but as a witness. Every room held life now. A refugee couple curled together on the old med cot. A group of children drawing galaxies on the ceiling tiles with glow chalk. An old soldier snoring softly in the storage bay. The dome wasn't a shelter anymore. It was a record. Of everyone who had come here broken and found a shape again. Of everyone who had knocked and not been turned away. Of everyone who had needed something as simple and impossible as a place to stay. Kael walked until he reached the greenhouse. Luma's tree, the one she insisted would grow blue fruit, was budding now. Not from miracle, but from maintenance, from care, from refusal to let the cold win. He knelt beside it, and for the first time placed his hand not over the soil, but in it. He pressed his fingers into the damp warmth, felt the root system pulse beneath. Alive, growing, and somewhere beneath that something else grew too. Something in him. He returned to his quarters before dawn. The comm unit Rin had given him sat on the table. Still broken, still useless. But he kept it anyway. Because sometimes what you couldn't fix still had a place in your life. Not as failure, but as reminder. As the new day broke across Daranis Theta, gray and cold and empty as ever, Kael stood by the dome's front airlock. Another knock could come, or none at all. He didn't care anymore. The dome wasn't about escape, or defense, or secrecy. It was a place where names meant something again, where Luma called him Papa, where Rin handed him faith in the form of broken metal, where Sarah stayed not because she had to, but because she chose to, and where Kael Varn, once lost, once ghosted by war and failure, had been named not by rank, but by love. There was no storm, not this time, just a long, pale hush outside the dome, like the world had paused to listen. Inside, the air was warm with breath and quiet voices. Someone had brewed tea. Someone else was fixing the heater seal again, the third time this week, Kael thought absently. It hissed like an old cat, but still held stubborn as the people who lived here. He stood near the greenhouse, not really working, just watching. The garden had changed. It wasn't just the lyra tree anymore, though it stood tallest, its strange blue-green leaves fluttering faintly in the climate-controlled breeze. There were other plants now, hybrid root bulbs, stalks with soft fruits, moss beds harvested for nutrient broth. More life than the world outside could hold. Cal bent down to examine a newly sprouted vine brushing soil from its stem. His fingers, once calloused from field surgeries and frostbite, were now rough from gardening. He didn't mind. Behind him, he heard Luma giggling as she taught two of the younger kids to draw suns on the hydro walls using her glow chalk. One of them, Tari, a wide-eyed Kestran child who had lost her parents on the escape ship, asked if suns were always so round. No, Luma said sagely, some of them are triangles if you believe hard enough. Kael smiled and turned away before they could catch him listening. The dome's population had grown to 23. Not a lot by city standards, but more than Kael had ever expected. Each one had arrived the same way, quiet, wary, cold, but with time, each one had begun to shed those layers. They called the place the Hearth. It had started as a joke. One of the engineers, named Malric, said the dome felt like a furnace compared to the outside. But the name stuck. People stopped saying the dome and started saying the Hearth, and it fit. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a rhythm, a pulse, a fire that didn't burn but endured. Kael was doing inventory with Rin later that day, double-checking power cells and heat rations. The boy had grown taller in the past few months, Kael realized. His shoulders are broader, his eyes are softer but smarter. Production rate's up 30%, Rin said, tapping his tablet. I think we can install another dehumidifier and start on the vertical moss bed. Kael nodded. You've done good work. Rin shrugged, but his cheeks colored. You thinking of building your own dome one day? Kael asked. Rin looked up. I used to think, that he admitted. Now I just want to make this one bigger, so more people can stay. Kael placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. That's more than enough. Rin nodded once and went back to his schematics, but not before shooting Kael a glance that said everything words couldn't. At dinner, they gathered around the long bench table, one Kael had reinforced with parts from an old drone cradle. Someone had cooked root stew again. Someone else brought in a tray of moss cakes from the greenhouse, a dessert that smelled faintly like mint and hope. They ate in shifts, but always with laughter. Sarah sat beside Kael sipping tea. She didn't speak much anymore, not because she had nothing to say, but because her silence was full now. Complete. Rested. The kind of quiet that only comes after you've laid your ghosts to sleep. She touched Kael's hand once during the meal. Not by accident, just long enough for him to understand you kept your promise, and Kael for once believed it. Later that night, Luma found him in the comm room. The transmitter was still active, broadcasting a low-cycle signal Kael had coded months ago. Not a distress call, not a beacon, just a sentence. We're here. You're not alone. You can stay. He hadn't stopped broadcasting it. He never would. Luma crawled into his lap, her arms wrapped around the old comm unit Rin had given him, still broken, still important. She held it out. Want me to fix it? Kael smiled. You think you can? She nodded. I have powers. He ruffled her hair. I know. She held the comm close. Sometimes I think this thing still remembers her, she whispered. Kael's smile faded softer now. Me too. They sat in silence, just the hum of the dome around them. Then Luma said, when I grow up, I want to make a dome for someone else. Kael raised an eyebrow. What for? So they don't feel cold like we did. He blinked slowly, then wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. You already did, little one. At dawn, Kael stood at the dome's edge once more, watching the snow swirl like smoke beyond the shields. He didn't expect what he saw. A figure small, walking toward the dome. Not staggering, not desperate, just approaching. Behind them, two more. Kael didn't tense. He didn't reach for a weapon. He opened the comm link. This is the Hearth, he said. If you're looking for a place to stay, the soup's warm. There was no reply, but the figures kept walking. Inside, Kael turned to the others. They're coming. Sarah nodded. We'll prepare beds. Rin smiled. I'll fire up the beacon. Luma skipped toward the mural wall, grabbing her chalk. Time to add more people. Kael watched them scatter with purpose, not panic. He stepped toward the greenhouse and glanced at the lyra tree. Its first fruit had begun to bud. Blue, bright, alive. He reached out and touched it gently like a memory. No longer a wound. Now a legacy. Later that evening, the newcomers arrived. 3 of them. One young man badly limping, a woman with sharp eyes and an old transmitter, a child barely older than Luma clutching a broken data pad like it was the last page of her story. They looked at Kael like he was unreal. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. Luma ran forward first. Hi, I'm Luma. This is the Hearth. You're safe now. Kael watched as she took the child's hand and led them inside. Sarah stepped forward to meet the others, guiding them gently toward warmth. Kael stayed at the door a moment longer. The snow blew around him cold and endless. But inside was fire. Not the kind that was destroyed, the kind that stayed. He picked up a piece of chalk from the bench beside Luma's mural wall and added a new figure to the painting. Not himself, not Sarah. Just a hand held out open at the edge of the drawing. Waiting, inviting. Not all stories need endings. Some become homes, some become hearths, and some are written not in battles or victories, but in the quiet choice to stay when others would run, to open the door, to answer the knock, to build something from the wreckage and name it worth keeping. Kael Varn was once a medic, a soldier, a ghost. Now he was Papa, of a girl who dreamt in stars, of a boy who fixed broken things, of a woman who refused to die for someone else's science, and of a family who stayed. In the heart of a frozen world, warmth didn't come from heat. It came from the people who dared to share it, and they weren't going anywhere. As the days passed and the dome continued to grow, so did the belief that had sparked its foundation. What had started as a place of survival, of cold isolation and loss, had transformed into something richer, more meaningful. It was a home, not just in the physical sense, but in a deeper, quieter way. A sanctuary built not with walls or shields, but with the fragile threads of trust, compassion, and choice. Kael, once haunted by his past, now found solace in the presence of those around him. The warmth of shared meals, the comfort of laughter, the steady hum of life in the dome, all intertwined into a new purpose. He was no longer just surviving. He was living again. And for the first time in years, he understood that true strength didn't come from weapons or control. It came from the willingness to let others in, to open a door and offer them shelter, even when the world outside seemed intent on tearing them apart. Luma's drawing of the tree with its blue fruit became more than a simple sketch. It symbolized hope, growth, and the potential for new beginnings in the face of relentless adversity. With every new face that crossed the threshold, the dome became more than just a refuge. It became a testament to what humanity could accomplish when it chose to stand together. Kael had built something that would outlast the cold, the storms and the ghosts of the past. He had created a home, and in doing so had forged a legacy that would continue to grow, not just in the soil, but in the hearts of those who dared to believe. The hearth was no longer just a place, it was a promise, and that promise was worth keeping.